Hi YouTube and welcome to my channel. My name is Patrick. I've been a lifelong Windows and Linux user, especially for the past decade or so where I'm almost exclusively was using Linux. However, I've come to a realization. macOS works way better for me, so let's talk about that. So again, I've been using Linux and Windows for about 12 years. Windows itself had the most issues. First of all, it was full of spyware. So for example, OneDrive, which is enabled by default now, does not have ends-to-end encryption, which is a massive oversight for something as personal as your files. And not to mention all of the telemetry that Microsoft collects from you from Windows. I mean, it's recording everything you type, everything you look at, everything you open. Microsoft is getting a copy of all of that. If that doesn't make you uncomfortable, I have a bridge to sell you. You see, the thing is, it's not about having something to hide. Privacy is a fundamental human right. And my point is not that I'm trying to hide anything, but rather that privacy is a prerequisite for dignity. Like when you go to use the bathroom, you close the door behind you, right? And it's not because you're trying to hide something. It's because, again, privacy is a prerequisite for dignity. Another issue that Windows always has had is security. So Defender is not that good. People say, oh, Windows Defender is all you need. Windows Defender does everything you need, and it's fine. It's not. It's just not. Windows Defender, especially with the default configuration out of the box, is not a secure AV system. It's just not. I've written about half a dozen pieces of Windows malware at this point, and Windows Defender never catches any of them. And so when people say, oh, Windows Defender is all you need, it's really not. It's not that good of an AV. And not to mention that the vast majority of pieces of malware are written for Windows. And there's a few reasons for that. Yes, part of it is because Windows is the most popular operating system in the world, but more than that, it's super easy to exploit Windows. You can really tell that when they designed Windows, security was an afterthought, not a primary motivation. And then there's stability. So with Windows, there's constant updates. And what does that have to do with stability? Well, you see, the thing is, I think that if you're having to forcefully reboot my computer every week or so to install updates and I don't get to choose when that happens, I mean, I guess, I know that you can go in and tweak it so it only updates during certain times, but it treats that like a suggestion rather than a hard rule, and it will sometimes just update for you whenever it feels like. And so I count that as an issue with stability, because if my system is not able to remain up and running for a reasonable amount of time, well, regardless of the cause of that, it's a stability issue. And also, there's this constant crashes, right? Everything from programs to crashing, to the OS crashing, to blue screens of death, to eating its own boot partition. It was just a bad experience when it came to stability. And speaking of bad experiences, Windows has a bad user experience. And I'm going to cut this out separate from the bad user interface, because the user experience and the user interface are two different things. But just a couple examples in what I mean by a bad experience. There's two settings apps. You have Control Panel and the Settings app, and both of them link back and forth between one another, seemingly randomly. Like, it's very easy to get into a workflow where you open the Settings app, you go to what you're trying to go to, and then it opens Control Panel, and then you click something in Control Panel, and it sends you back to the Settings app. What the hell is that? And it's just full of these archaic little roundabout things that just don't make any sense. And then, of course, the UI itself is bad. So the Windows user interface is a mix of the past 10 years of Windows user interfaces. You've got stuff from Vista, you've got stuff from XP. Hell, you've even got stuff from Windows 95 in there. And it's clear that they don't have the ability to update all the parts of Windows, which makes me lose a lot of confidence in their ability to keep my system stable and secure, which I didn't have much confidence in them anyway, given my experiences. But again, just the user interface, yes, the top coat of paint is pretty, but as soon as you see the chips in it and all of the old wallpapers that sat beneath that, it really doesn't look good. And then the bloatware. Oh my god, the bloatware. So Windows comes with a ton of applications that you probably don't need, you probably don't want, but they're in there anyway by default. And also, while we're on this subject, another thing is that it comes with shortcuts to a bunch of third-party programs, a bunch of third-party programs that paid Microsoft to be in your start menu by default. Those are ads, right? And I don't want ads in my operating system. You know, if my operating system that I paid for is serving me ads, something's seriously wrong there. Alright, so yeah, Windows, we all know Windows sucks. We all know Windows has issues, right? But I also said I'd been using Linux for a while, so what's going on with that? Well, Linux has its own issues. Number one is compatibility. So, Linux is incompatible with the majority of the software that I need to do my job. It just doesn't have alternatives for the stuff that I need to be able to do, and the alternatives that do exist are not cross-compatible with the industry standards. Meaning, if I want to use Linux, I can't really collaborate with anybody, except when it comes to certain workflows such as development and writing shell scripts and that kind of thing. Linux works great for that, but anything involving a creative workflow where you have to collaborate with more than one person, it just becomes a mess and it's just not possible. And also, it didn't have any support for the cloud storage systems that I use, which I know that's a me problem. I know Dropbox and Google Drive have Linux clients, but I don't really want to use those. And so, you know, it's kind of harkens back to what I just said. You know, the compatibility with the things that you need just isn't there. And so that's software compatibility, right? Also, hardware compatibility was an issue too. I've got plenty of hardware that just straight up doesn't work on Linux. Everything from my T470 ThinkPad trackpad to my Wi-Fi dongles, Bluetooth dongles, to graphics cards that I've tried to use. You know, it seems like with every computer where I've tried to use Linux, there's been something on it that just doesn't work hardware-wise. And so, also, Linux has issues with stability. And I know I'm gonna piss some people off by saying this, but it's true. You know, it crashes frequently. Just last night, I was playing around with my ThinkPad T470, and I installed Fedora on it just for fun. And when I clicked a button on the trackpad, it crashed. It just froze and didn't recover. I couldn't even get into an alternative TTY. So, yeah, that's kind of indicative of the experience that I've had with Linux. It tends to crash and be a bit too unstable, regardless of the distribution, right? Because I'm not talking about a single distribution here. Every distribution that I've used has destroyed itself in some new and creative way. Now, I know that's a skill issue, right? And I admit that's a skill issue, but I'm not doing anything crazy on them. And the fact that they all break on me and then I have to spend hours fixing them, that's time that I just don't have. Honestly, I don't have time to be fixing my system every time an update comes out because I have work to do. And if you're watching this, then you probably have work to do too. Get back to work. What are you doing? Alright, so that brings us to macOS. So, macOS. I bought a Mac Mini about 6 months ago, and it's been great. So let's talk about those points I just mentioned. How about spyware? So Apple does collect some telemetry data, but it's not nearly as invasive as Microsoft. And then also iCloud is end-to-end encrypted. If you enable advanced data protection, then your iCloud files are end-to-end encrypted between your devices. Apple has no visibility into them, which is amazing for privacy. Comparing that to OneDrive or Dropbox, those systems have no end to end encryption, and the hosting providers who run those services have full visibility into your files. Now, I don't know about you, I don't want my files to be able to be seen by anybody who's not me. That just feels like a basic requirement for privacy. So the fact that iCloud has end-to-end encryption is a big win, and it makes spying on me that much harder. And also, the telemetry is just much less invasive than what you get on Windows. So with Windows, it's recording everything you do, everything you click, everything you type. macOS has a much smaller scope of what it collects, and it does still collect some stuff, and Linux is still better than macOS when it comes to privacy, but macOS is a happy middle ground between Windows and Linux. Also, security. So, as I mentioned, I've written about half a dozen different pieces of malware for Windows. I've also written about a dozen pieces of malware for Linux. But guess what? When it comes to macOS, I haven't been able to write a single piece of malware for it that worked. And that is partly because I'm just not very good at it. It's totally possible to write macOS malware, I just suck at it. But the fact that it was so easy for me to do on Windows, so easy for me to do on Linux, compared to how hard it is for me to do on macOS, gives me some peace of mind. And also, macOS just has a better sandboxing and permission system than Linux or Windows. Yes, on Linux you can get Flatpaks or snaps which are sandboxed, but if you look at the permissions on them, you really start wondering what the point of that sandbox is. Because the thing is, most Flatpaks, most snaps ship with more permissions than what they need. And it really kind of defeats the purpose of a sandbox. And obviously, Windows has no concept of a sandbox. I mean, there's UWP apps, but who actually uses UWP apps? I bet no one's even heard of them who were watching this. And then stability. So it's only been 6 months, but my Mac has never crashed on me. I've never had to reinstall the operating system. Whereas with Linux, it would last about 6 to 10 months before I had to reinstall again from scratch, or spend hours trying to fix it, which was, again, not a good experience. But yeah, the Mac has never crashed on me. Everything just works. Trademark, right? And, I mean, there's some truth to that, though. The Mac really does just do what it needs to do and get out of the way. And then the user experience. So, the Mac OS user experience is better than anything you can get on any Linux distribution, and it's far superior to Windows 10 and Windows 11. Everything is consistent, there's only one settings menu, everything is right where you would expect it to be, and the user experience, the workflow that you use when you're navigating around your Mac, is very logical, smooth, pretty, and it just feels good. It just feels better, which I know that's not a very scientific way of measuring this, but I would go as far as to say that macOS generally is going to be better liked than Windows or Linux by an end user. And I think that comes down to the user experience being so much more superior. And obviously the UX is better than Windows. I think that goes without saying. See, the thing is, back in the 80s and 90s, Microsoft was in a patent dispute with Apple. Apple said that they invented the GUI, which they didn't. They did not. That was Xerox PARC. Apple ripped off Xerox PARC. But Apple got the patents for a lot of the elements of the graphical user interface, and they sued Microsoft saying that Windows ripped them off. And so what happened is Microsoft went about things backwards. They started doing things in the opposite way from what macOS was doing, because they wanted to avoid further lawsuits. So what the end result is that in macOS, things are done in a pretty logical way, but on Windows, things are done the opposite way, because it's always been that way, and they were trying to avoid getting sued. And then the user interface. It's so damn pretty. And this is subjective, right? Not everybody's going to think that it looks as good as I do. But I would fair to say that it's much prettier than Linux or Windows. Well, okay, I say that, but honestly, you can make Linux look way better than macOS. And the best part about it is that you can make it look good to you. And what I mean is that Linux is so customizable, you can make it look however you want. So I do think that Linux, when measured against macOS, I think Linux looks better, especially GNOME. GNOME looks a lot like macOS, but I think it looks prettier if I'm being honest. And Windows just looks like shit in comparison to both of them. If I'm being honest, the UI in Windows 11 not only is there tons of cruft buried under the surface, old interfaces from years gone by, but also that top coat of paint they put on everything honestly doesn't look very good to me. And the thing that wins on the Mac over both options, and the thing that the Mac does better than both Linux and Windows, is the consistency of the UI. On Linux, you have a combination of different graphical toolkits that are being used. You have GTK, you have Qt, you have ICE-D, and there's just so many different graphical toolkits that you often end up with a combination of programs that look very mismatched from one another. While on macOS, everything looks like it was designed for macOS because it was. And then bloatware. So yes, there are some pre-installed programs on my macOS that you can't get rid of that would probably be good to get rid of. Uh, but you see, it's mostly a clean system. Linux does it better, right? Linux is much cleaner, much less bloat, and it doesn't come with anything that you can't remove, which is the right way to do that. macOS, on the other hand, comes with stuff like Apple TV, Apple News, and you can't remove them. It's basically just a permanent advertisement for those services stuck in your app drawer. And, so that's not great. But when you consider all of the other things that makes macOS work better than Linux, I'm willing to put up with a couple programs that I can't remove. And speaking of those programs I can't remove, ads. So, like I just said, you can't get rid of Apple News, you can't get rid of Apple TV on a Mac, and I consider that to be an ad for those services. However, the only other ad I've ever seen was for iCloud, and I've never seen an ad for a third-party sketchy-ass program like Candy Crush Saga. macOS doesn't sell ad space in macOS. Like, Apple just does not let third parties buy ads in the macOS system. It's just not a thing. And obviously, Linux is the best when it comes to this because there's no one to sell ad space to. Like, there's no one who can actually sell that ad space in the OS to anybody. And so Linux is the best when it comes to the number of ads. macOS is better than Windows, though, by far. And so, at the end of the day, there's some stuff that Linux does better than macOS. There's some stuff that Windows does better than macOS, such as window management. But when you take a holistic view at things and you consider the full picture of what each system has to offer you, I think that for me personally, macOS works the best for my workflow and what I need to do. For other people, you're going to be better served by Linux. And for a small number of people, you're going to be best served by Windows. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Patrick. Hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. That's a good way to let me know that you want to see more similar videos. And I hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next one.